Your bank account is not property. It is a loan to a bankrupt entity. The state views your savings as an uncollected tax or a liquidation target. Influencers tell you to buy the dip. They need your exit liquidity. Optimism is a sedative. While you hope for recovery, they extract the value.
Every dollar inside the banking perimeter is a tether to a sinking ship.
The opportunity narrative is a choreographed trap for the masses. This is not a cycle. It is a controlled demolition of your purchasing power. The liquidation protocol is the state's only path to solvency. You are the fuel. Digital balances are mere permissions. Permissions that can be revoked instantly. We will now dissect the mechanism of your theft. Look closer. To understand the liquidation, we must define the mechanism used against you. Financial repression, a clinical term for the state's survival at your expense.
It is the invisible tax. No legislation is passed, yet your value evaporates.
Negative real interest rates. The bank pays you less than the currency loses. Your balance grows numerically. Your purchasing power dies biologically. This is intentional. Every dollar in a bank is a request for permission to exist. True sovereignty requires an air gap between your life and their ledger. Self-sovereignty isn't a choice. It is the only way to hold your keys. Physical isolation. If they cannot touch the code, they cannot liquidate you. The mechanism relies on your participation. It fails when you become unreachable.
Look at the numbers. They are not just digits. They are a death sentence.
US debt to GDP has breached the horizon. There is no mathematical return path. Interest payments now consume the tax revenue. The state is effectively insolvent. If rates stay high, the state defaults. If they drop, the currency dies. They will always choose the death of your currency to save their ledger.
Inflation must outpace rates. This is not an accident, it is the plan. Your bank account is a shared room with the state. They have the key. True safety requires a barrier. A physical boundary where their reach simply ends.
Self-sovereignty is the only air gap left in a world of digital confiscation. The math is finalized. Now, let us examine the cage you call diversification. You are told to diversify, to spread your risk across various asset classes. But in a regulated system, diversification is a hall of mirrors. Stocks, bonds, and savings accounts all share the same structural ceiling. You aren't moving assets. You are merely choosing which pocket is picked first. The banking apparatus is a closed loop. Every choice is a state-permitted action. Real diversification requires the removal of the counterparty. A move towards self-sovereignty. If your wealth requires a permission to access, it is not your wealth. It is a temporary lease from the central authority, subject to their liquidation needs. True security exists outside the digital perimeter, in the cold, unyielding physical space.
The illusion of choice ends when the exits are air-gapped from the system.
Grind, hustle, repeat. They tell you hard work is the antidote to poverty, but your 5% raise is a death sentence against 10% structural inflation. You are running a race where the finish line retreats faster than you sprint. Toxic positivity is the sedative used to keep the labor force compliant. Every extra hour of overtime is a gift to the sovereign's debt pile.
To outwork a dying currency is a mathematical impossibility. Stop the sprint.
True wealth requires a space that does not exist on a central ledger. Sovereignty is a physical reality. Cold storage is the border they cannot cross. By removing your assets from the grid, you revoke the state's permission.
Your labor belongs to you, only if the storage belongs to no one else.
Inflation is not an economic target. It is a minimum requirement for state survival. The sovereign debt is a mountain that cannot be scaled. It must be melted.
To the state, the 2% target is the floor, not the ceiling. They require the velocity of theft to outpace the interest on their own decay.
Your savings are the fuel. Engineered inflation is the combustion engine. If prices stop rising, the state's leverage collapses into a black hole. Stability is the state's enemy. Controlled erosion is their only path to solvency. This is the velocity of theft. A tax on time that you never voted for.
The currency must die, so the institution can live another day.
The machine isn't broken. It's working perfectly. And you are its designated victim.
You were promised a seat at the table. Instead, you are the meal.
The middle class is no longer a destination. It is a holding cell.
Home ownership has morphed into a lifetime of high-interest servitude.
You are working for a currency that actively hates you.
Every milestone reached feels like a moving goalpost. This is the psychology of betrayal. The contract was broken long ago.
You do not own your life. You lease it from banks.
Distance, cold observation. Real wealth is being moved behind walls you cannot climb.
True sovereignty requires an exit. A physical severance from their ledger. To survive the liquidation, you must stop being a line item.
The bank is not a vault. It is a highly regulated processing plant. Regulatory frameworks like Basel III are not designed to protect your balance. They are the blueprints for a system-wide containment of private capital. Banks are forced to prioritize high-quality liquid assets. This means government debt.
Your savings are being repurposed to fund the very state that devalues them.
You are a captive lender in a cage made of compliance and regulation. The liquidity coverage ratio ensures your money never leaves the state's orbit. This is the regulatory cage. It is efficient, digital, and entirely absolute.
To be reachable by a bank is to be liquidable by the state.
True sovereignty requires an air gap, a space where their regulations cannot reach. History is not a circle. It is a recurring diagnostic of state survival. Post-1945, the playbook was simple. Cap interest rates and let inflation run. This was the first great liquidation of the middle-class bank balance. But the current cycle is more aggressive. The state's reach is now total.
Back then, money was physical. Today, your savings are a digital permission slip.
If the state can track it, the state can harvest it for debt. True self-sovereignty requires an air gap between your pulse and their system. Cold storage is more than hardware. It is a refusal to be harvested. It moves your assets into the shadows, beyond the reach of the state's light. The diagnosis is clear. The system is not broken. You are simply its fuel. Understand this clearly. The system isn't failing. It is working with surgical, cold precision. Your savings are not your wealth. They are the collateral for a sovereign debt crisis. Inflation is not an accident. It is the chosen method for your slow, systematic liquidation. The state has a debt it cannot pay. Therefore, it must harvest the purchasing power of your time. They don't want you bankrupt. They want you just solvent enough to remain fuel. Within the banking perimeter, you are a line item, a permission-based existence. Every dollar in a central bank is a liability you don't control. It's an unlocked vault. To survive the liquidation, you need an air gap, a physical border between you and the ledger. Self-sovereignty isn't a choice. It's the only logical exit from a system designed to consume you. The protocol is running. You are the target, unless you remove yourself from the map. Look at your retirement projection. It is a work of clinical fiction. $1 million in 20 years is not a fortune. It is a survival kit. The state permits you to save because they intend to harvest later. Engineered inflation is the slow-motion heist of your future self's energy. Your 401k is a locked box. The state holds the only key. By the time you reach for it, the currency will be a ghost. Compounding interest is a lie when the denominator is infinite. You are funding the system that is currently liquidating your lifestyle. A digital number in a regulated vault is merely permission to exist. True sovereignty requires an air gap between your life and their ledger. Physical cash was the last vestige of true financial privacy. It was untraceable. Digital debits are not money. They are trackable behavioral permissions recorded in real time.
When your wealth is programmable, the state controls the if, when, and how. You have transitioned from being a wealth owner to a digital serf. A bank account is simply a ledger of promises they can revoke instantly. To escape this grid, your assets must exist where their reach cannot follow. True sovereignty requires a physical barrier, an air gap between your future and their servers. If you do not hold the physical keys, you are merely a guest. Cold storage is not just a tool. It is a declaration of total independence. The state's liquidation protocol stops exactly where your private air gap begins. Choose sovereignty. The financial advisor is not your strategist. They are a state-sanctioned retention officer. Their primary function is to keep your capital within the perimeter of easy seizure. They operate under a permit system. Every recommendation is pre-filtered by regulatory compliance. To them, diversification means choosing which state-controlled pocket your wealth resides in. True sovereignty requires an air gap, a space where the state's reach physically terminates. Physicality is your only immunity. If it cannot be touched, it cannot be regulated. This is the self-sovereignty protocol, moving assets beyond the digital reach of banking servers. An advisor fears outflows. They fear the moment you realize the bank is a cage. Your wealth is a state asset until you physically remove the permission to access it. The guide you pay for is actually the gatekeeper you must bypass. Prepare for the exit. Ownership is the most successful marketing fiction of the 20th century. Property taxes prove you are merely renting your life from the state.
Stop paying for 1 year, and the illusion of ownership dissolves instantly.
The mortgage is not a ladder. It is a 20-year leash.
Your home is an illiquid liability, masquerading as a store of value. Observation of a trap. Real estate traps you in a physical jurisdiction for easy liquidation. Maintenance, insurance, and interest are the friction of your digital serfdom. True sovereignty requires assets that do not exist on a state register. Physical keys, physical control, no permits, no middlemen, no state access. If you cannot carry your wealth, it belongs to the territory. Wealth is never truly destroyed. It is merely redistributed toward the source of issuance. This is the Cantillon effect. Proximity to the printer is the only true advantage. The first recipients spend the money before prices rise. You spend it last. By the time the currency reaches your pocket, its purchasing power is already dead. The middle class isn't failing. It is being used as a shock absorber. Inflation is the state's silent partner. It liquidates your labor to service their debt. To survive, you must create an air gap between your assets and their permission. Physical self-custody is the only vault the central banking protocol cannot audit. If you do not hold the keys, you are merely a line item awaiting liquidation.
The Cantillon winners have their printer. You must have your perimeter. Establish it now.
Repression is a slow bleed. Confiscation is a sudden, clinical amputation of access. The first indicator: enhanced security protocols that treat your withdrawals like heist attempts.
When the bank asks the purpose of your transfer, you are no longer a customer.
You are a suspect requesting permission to use your own stored labor energy. The second indicator: the narrowing of the exit. Capital controls disguised as stability measures. True sovereignty requires an air gap. A psychological and physical severing from the ledger. Self-custody is not an investment strategy. It is the only remaining off switch. If your assets require a third-party login, they are merely a conditional permission. The regulatory perimeter is a cage. Physical cold storage is the hole in the fence. The state has identified you as liquidity. It is time to become invisible to the protocol. Cognitive dissonance is the final anesthetic administered before the clinical liquidation of your class. You believe the system is broken. It is not. It is performing exactly as designed. The middle class clings to the normalcy bias, like a child clutching a hollow toy. You check your balance. You see numbers. You mistake permission to spend for ownership.
The state permits your wealth only as long as it remains within their regulatory reach.
When the doors lock, your denial becomes the very wall that traps you inside.
Survival requires an air gap, a space where the state's reach ends and yours begins.
True self-sovereignty isn't a digital asset. It is a physical boundary against the liquidation protocol.
The only safe asset is the one that does not exist on their ledger.
Refuse the comfort of the cage. The doors have already begun to close. Acceptance is the first step toward survival. The exit is narrow.
You do not own your bank balance. You own a permission. A permission that can be revoked at the speed of a keystroke. To escape, you must transition from the permit system to sovereignty.
Sovereignty requires assets that do not ask for leave to exist.
Most assets are just ghosts inside a central bank's ledger. True security is physical, cold, and removed from the network.
The air gap is a psychological barrier. It is the air gap between your life and their liquidation.
An unhackable vault where the only key is your consciousness.
This is not an investment. This is a separation of powers. The banking system is not a vault. It is a permission-based permit system. If your wealth requires a login, it is a liability, not an asset.
To escape the liquidation protocol, you must achieve a physical air gap.
Sovereignty is the absence of a third party. It is the cold storage of reality.
Regulation cannot touch what it cannot reach through the central nervous system.
This is the air gap philosophy. Your keys are your only true borders. The hook of the integration, empowering through cold logic. The state cannot liquidate what it does not hold the keys to.
You are exiting the perimeter of their control. This is the start of sovereignty. The protocol is simple. Remove the middleman, secure the physical, become the bank.
Transitioning from a target to a sovereign requires an architectural divorce from the system. The exit strategy begins by establishing an air gap between your labor and their ledger. Physical cold storage is not an investment. It is a non-permeable membrane for wealth. In the sovereign protocol, your keys are physical ghosts, untouchable by banking regulations.
The central bank cannot liquidate what it cannot mathematically perceive or physically reach.
Self-sovereignty is the removal of the permission layer from your financial existence. You are shifting your assets from a liability on their balance sheet to a private reality. This architecture requires physical privacy and the rejection of the convenience trap.
Once the air gap is closed, you are no longer exit liquidity for the state's debt. The exit is now built. The only remaining variable is your speed of execution.
Imagine the year 2030. Your inertia has become your financial architecture. By staying within the banking perimeter, you accepted a life of digital rationing. You no longer own assets. You subscribe to a permission-based existence.
Every transaction is a request. Every withdrawal is a confession to the state.
The self-sovereign exit you ignored is now a sealed, physical impossibility.
In the 2030 protocol, your savings are just a state-managed liability.
The air gap between you and the regulator has vanished. You are integrated. True sovereignty requires a physical disconnect, a fortress the central ledger cannot see. Without private keys and physical custody, you are merely an entry in their liquidation file.
This is the cost of your silence. The protocol has already calculated your end. The state will soon offer a sedative. They call it relief. It is bait.
Stimulus packages are not gifts. They are accelerants for the liquidation protocol. Every check printed is a silent confiscation of your stored labor's value. You celebrate the deposit while the currency's heartbeat slows to a terminal rhythm. True sovereignty requires an air gap, a vault the state cannot reach or regulate. Relief is designed to maintain the velocity of theft. It keeps you spending. By accepting digital credits, you consent to stay within their regulatory cage. The state does not rescue. It merely manages the pace of your obsolescence. Every dollar received is a wire around your neck. Disconnect your assets now.
The relief is the final stage of the trap. The doors are closing.
The state has reached its diagnostic conclusion. The liquidation of your purchasing power is non-negotiable. Every dollar in the banking perimeter is now a fuel cell for sovereign debt. To exist within their ledgers is to accept your status as a state asset. Self-sovereignty requires an air gap, a psychological and physical severing from the central apparatus. If your keys are not physical, your wealth is merely a temporary permission from a bank. The air gap is your firewall against the state's terminal hunger for your labor. You are currently choosing between being a sovereign individual or a line item for liquidation. The banking system is a controlled demolition. Physical cold storage is the only exit. Do not wait for the regulatory doors to lock. They have already been greased.
The state has made its choice. The protocol for your liquidation is active. Make yours. The data is absolute. The protocol for your liquidation is already active.
Remaining within the centralized system is no longer a risk. It is a certainty.
True sovereignty requires an air gap between your life and their ledger.
If you do not hold the physical keys, you are merely a tenant. Secure your assets beyond the reach of those who print the debt. Every second you wait is a donation to your own dispossession.
The doors of the traditional vault are locking from the outside.
Final recommendation: the peak of the self-sovereignty narrative. Choose the cold reality of self-custody over the warm lie of banking.
The diagnostic is complete. Your exit is your own responsibility now. Liquidation protocol concluded. Transition to self-sovereignty or vanish. Goodbye.